The Great Wall of China. It is perhaps one of the most iconic security investments that any country has ever built, stretching over mountains, deserts, grasslands. It winds across northern China like a giant stone snake. Yet contrary to the popular belief, the wall was not a single continuous project by one emperor. In fact, it goes back a long, long way. It is the legacy of many dynasties over more than 2,000 years, built, destroyed, rebuilt, and modified in fits and starts. It has witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the clash of nomads and farmers, and of course the changing philosophies of Chinese statecraft. Oh, and by the way, you can't actually see it from space. Now, with all that in mind, today we go on an exploration of the Great Wall of China. It's a story that is as winding and layered as the structure itself. And we'll talk about not only the engineering feats of it, but the mindset of a civilization balancing between fear and confidence. It's quite a fascinating story. So how about you come with me, and we can learn all about it. But first, let me welcome you to the channel. We are going to have a great time today. If you are new here, I invite you to click the subscribe button, and if you're coming back, well, welcome back. Now, this video, along with every other video on the channel, is proudly ad-free for your enjoyment, your uninterrupted viewing. This is made possible due to the contributions of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who had the curiosity to check out the merch store, and the occasional donation. All of the appropriate links for those inclined are in the pinned comment and video description, as well as the channel description. Now, without further ado, let's set out on our journey. Of course, we have to start from long before there was this perception of our modern rendering of a Great Wall. Long before a unified perception of that existed, ancient Chinese states built their own walls. Now, we've got to start from the Eastern Zhou dynasty, especially the spring and autumn period, that is 771 to 476 BCE, and moving into the subsequent warring states period, 475 to 221, where China was divided into rival kingdoms, and that rivalry, of course, was in constant conflict with each other. It didn't help that there was all the raiders from the northern steppes either. Problems. Well, problems require solutions. In any case, each state sought to protect its borders by constructing fortified walls and earthen ramparts. And these early walls were not like the ones that we see now. They were typically made of compacting earth and gravel between wooden boards. It's a technique of what they call hung tu, which is rammed earth. Not unique to the Chinese. But they were not yet the majestic stone battlements we see today. These would come in much later. In any case, they were more about function rather than form. They served as vital barriers against both hostile neighbors, but also nomadic incursions, whichever one of them came first. And so by the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, several states already had notable defensive wall systems. The state of Qi, for example, built a long wall in today's Shandong province as early as the 7th century. Some historians consider this the first Great Wall, albeit in a loose sense. Now, Qi's wall, about 600 kilometers in length, defended its territory from attacks by the state of Chu to the south and various nomadic groups. Now, speaking of the state of Chu, there was a fortified border known as the Square Wall, in Chinese Fangcheng, built to guard its northern frontier. Meanwhile, the state of Zhao constructed walls in two phases. One wall around 333 BCE along its southern border to fend off the state of Wei, and another around 300 BCE along its northern frontier. The northern Zhao Wall was initiated by the visionary King Wuling of Zhao, who famously reformed his army to wear the attire of the Hu, which is nomads, and master cavalry tactics too. After adopting nomadic-style warfare, if you can't beat them, join them, I suppose, King Wuling still found it prudent to build a line of defense, just in case. And so they did. An earthen wall snaking through the hills of northern Shanxi to protect agricultural lands from the very steppe nomads whose ways he had learned. And then we had the state of Yan in the northeast. They also built an extensive wall. In 290 BCE, Yan constructed a wall along the Yanshan Mountains to shield against incursions by the Donghu and other northern tribes. That wall, reportedly over 500 kilometers long, was one of the last big walls before China's unification. Other smaller states, such as Wei and Zhongshan, raised their own defenses in this period of endemic warfare too. Now, these early walls were certainly local in scope, but they are important when we're talking about the evolution of walls, or even great walls. They certainly mark the origin of the idea, using massive labor to build linear fortifications across different terrain for strategic defense. They were built by peasants and laborers under duress. Defending one's state often meant back-breaking work for the common people. Tales of suffering began early on. There was a famous legend from this era that involves the beacon towers of Western Xia, that is, preceding the warring states. It is said that King Yo of Zhou died 771 BCE, lit warning beacons as a practical joke to amuse his concubine, tricking his lords into mustering troops for a non-existent emergency. Well, when a real rebellion came, the story goes that no one answered the beacon fire. The boy who cried wolf, reminiscent of that. Of course, this resulted in the downfall of the king. Everyone thought it was another one of his clever jokes. Well, who's laughing now? Whether it's true or not, still a bit of a cautionary tale. It shows how seriously these signal towers and walls were taken in the Chinese imagination. In any case, by 221 BC, on the eve of imperial unification, northern China's landscape was etched with walls from various states, like segmented pieces of armor along the long frontier. But it would take a true conqueror of great ambition to link these fragments into something greater. And here we are, at the first great emperor. 221 BCE, King Zheng of Qin defeated his rival states and unified China, proclaiming himself Qin Shi Huangdi, which literally means the first emperor of the Qin, Huangdi meaning emperor, by the way. Among the transformative projects launched by this new emperor, who centralized administration, standardized writing, currency, built roads, standardized all the weights, that sort of thing, was an unprecedented defensive bulwark in the north. Qin Shi Huang decided to connect and extend the existing walls of the former warring states to create a continuous barrier against nomadic peoples of Inner Asia, especially the ever-troublesome Xiongnu Confederation pressing on the northern borders. It was essentially the Great Wall in its first rendering, the big project of a newly imperial China. Now, historical records from the Qin era are pretty scarce, unfortunately, and that is, well, it's Qin Shi Huangdi's fault. He burnt many books, not to mention burning the people who wrote the books. Perhaps a topic for another video, I suppose. We won't get into that. But the great Han Dynasty historian, Sima Qian, 145 to 90 BCE, gives an account in his Records of the Grand Historian. Well, according to Sima Qian, Emperor Qin Shi Huang sent his trusted general Meng Tian to drive back the Xiongnu and fortify the frontier. Meng Tian marshaled hundreds of thousands of laborers. Some sources say up to 300,000 of them. That includes soldiers and convicted criminals, to build the Wanli Changcheng, which literally means the long wall of 10,000 li. Li is about a third of a mile, by the way. So 10,000 li, that suggests a wall over 3,000 miles long. Though the phrase is usually a metaphor. Oh, and 10,000. That is usually just used as a number to express a great amount. If you say like 1 nian, like 10,000 years, you're pretty much just trying to express forever, this kind of thing. But using and linking the old walls of Zhao, Yan, and others, Meng Tian's forces constructed ramparts stretching from the Gansu corridor in the west all the way to the coast of Dongbei in the east. By about 212 BC, this early Great Wall traversed northern China's rugged terrain in an arc delineating the empire's northern limit. But unlike the latter stone walls of the Ming, the Qin Great Wall was mostly made of tamped earth, clay, and gravel. Still a pretty good achievement. No one's denying that. Workers built it by piling earth between wooden frames layer by layer. A pretty arduous task, performed in remote mountains and deserts. Trees were cut for palisades and gates. This was back-breaking labor for sure. Countless workers are said to have perished under the harsh conditions, and ancient accounts claim that the bones of the dead were buried in the wall, giving rise to that grim legend that each stone of the Great Wall represents a fallen worker. But there's a bit of doubt of that in terms of modern historical thought. Not many people believe that workers were literally entombed inside the wall en masse, aside from possibly a quick burial near work sites. Suppose we can't really argue against that, since bodies, of course, would weaken the structure's integrity. However, the high-def toll, that's pretty unquestionable. The popular folklore tale of Meng Jiangnu illustrates this suffering too. In that legend, a young wife treks to the wall to find that her husband has died from exhaustion and has been built into the actual wall itself. Her bitter weeping causes the section of the wall to collapse, revealing his bones so she can give him a proper burial. Well, it's just a myth, sure. But it certainly symbolizes the human cost of the Qin wall's construction. Not many happy stories about that time, that's for sure. In any case, the Qin dynasty's wall had immediate strategic value. It created a continuous northern barrier for the first time, slowing down the raids of the Xiongnu horsemen. The wall was studded with beacon towers for signaling too. By day, columns of smoke. By night, fire. These signals could race from tower to tower, warning the capital of invasions in a matter of hours. In fact, Chinese sources call such signals Langyan, that means wolf smoke, because burning wolf dung was said to produce a particularly thick and steady smoke that wouldn't dissipate in the wind. A network of patrol roads and garrison forts accompanied the wall, and General Meng Tian also built straight roads southward to the Qin heartland, so troops and supplies could move swiftly to any threatened point. In essence, Qin Shi Huang had created a structured military frontier. A job very well done. Of course, done by other people. I'm sure that Qin Shi Huang wasn't getting his hands dirty on the work site. Well, let's move on to the Han Dynasty. That's 202 BCE to 220 CE. And that followed the Qin Dynasty and was one of China's golden ages. We'll get to the other golden age later. And it both consolidated and extended the Great Wall. The early Han emperors, starting with Gaozu or Liu Bang in 202, were cautious about overextending, but eventually they faced the same relentless threat from the Xiongnu nomads of the north. The Han knew that mere walls were not a complete solution. It was something, but diplomacy and warfare had to go hand in hand, But they valued the defensive advantage that walls provided. Certainly better to have the wall around than not. Over 4 centuries, the Han regime repaired older walls and built new stretchers, pushing the defensive lines deeper northwest into Central Asia than ever before. A key turning point was the reign of Emperor Wu of Han, that is 141 to 87 BCE, an aggressive ruler who decided to break the Xiongnu's power. Emperor Wu dispatched the explorer envoy Zhang Qian around 138 BCE on a mission to the Western regions, that being Central Asia, to seek allies and intelligence. Zhang Qian's epic journey, he was even captured by the Xiongnu for years, by the way, before reaching as far as Bactria, ultimately revealed trade opportunities, but the possibility of an alliance with Central Asian peoples too. So when Zhang Qian returned in 125, the Han court gained both knowledge and motivation to secure the Hexi corridor, that is the narrow Gansu corridor linking China to the west. To protect this crucial corridor, which was a lifeline of the emerging Silk Road trade, the Han Empire extended the Great Wall westward, all the way to the gates of the Tarim Basin. Under Emperor Wu and his successors, walls and signal towers were built across the Gobi deserts to Dunhuang, where the famous Yumen Pass and the Yang Pass guarded the routes to Central Asia. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the Han Great Wall system stretched from the seaside in the east to the sands of Central Asia in the west, further than any wall would reach for another 1,500 years. The Han-era walls were, like the Qin-era ones, largely composed of ram earth and crude stone in the western regions. Some of these remote sections survive today as low earthen ridges, dotted with the ruins of watchtowers slowly crumbling away in the desert. They mark the Han Empire's determined push to secure the Silk Road trade routes from nomadic banditry. And along this wall line, the Han established military agricultural colonies and garrison towns. One notable defensive strategy was the creation of Zhonghu, that is border guard farmers, soldiers who would also farm the land near their forts, making frontier regions self-sustaining. The wall was their shield, but also a base from which to launch counterattacks or pursue retreating raiders. And here's a window into Han strategic thinking, one that comes from the famous debate on salt and iron held in 81 BCE. In this debate, recorded by Huan Quan, scholars argued the merits of Emperor Wu's expansive and expensive policies. The Lord Grand Secretary, as one of the high officials, defended the government's monopolies on taxes, explaining that they were needed to fund the frontier defenses, and he reminded the court that the Xiongnu had once freely raided into Chinese territory, plundering and devastating the frontier settlements, until the late emperor constructed fortifications and watchtowers to protect the people. These forts and towers, clearly referring to the Great Wall system and its garrisons, of course required heavy expenditure, since the salt and iron monopolies were there to pay for them. Opposing scholars steeped in Confucian ideals countered that moral governance would negate the need for costly wars. If the emperor ruled virtuously, even the barbarians would submit without a fight. One critic even quoted Confucius, "Of what use to him is expenditure," implying that virtue could succeed where walls could not. The secretary rebuked that idea. Such idealism apparently ignored the reality. He argued that the Xiongnu were fierce, They were not persuaded by virtue, only by force and preparedness. Thus, walls and armies were indispensable. So in the end, the emperor kept the monopolies and frontier defenses, indicating that the practical view prevailed. Well, during the Western Han period, especially the 1st century, a sprawling line of Han Great Wall fortifications spanned over 4,000 kilometers. The Han walls often followed a two-tier strategy, an inner line closer to Chinese settlements and an outer line in the steppe. The outer line included a string of beacon towers and fortified supply points across the desert, enabling the famous journeys of Han generals like Huo Qubing and Wei Qing, who campaigned deep into Xiongnu territory. The Han even erected a monumental pillar, the Yumen Pass tablet at the western end of their wall, effectively proclaiming that that was the empire's limit, at least for now. Well, these defenses were not static barriers, but just part of an active defense in depth. The walls deterred small-scale raiders and gave early warning of larger invasions, buying time for the Han cavalry to respond. And indeed, the Han managed to push the Xiongnu north of the Gobi for a time. The empire maintained these remote defenses until economic strain and nomadic resurgence forced a partial withdrawal. And by the Eastern Han, that's the 1st and 2nd century CE, the empire's focus shifted more to internal stability, and some frontier posts were abandoned. Nevertheless, even as late as 150 CE, Chinese generals like Ban Chao could operate along the far-flung watchtowers of the wall in the western regions, and that certainly shows how far the Han shield had extended. But eventually the Han dynasty collapsed. Come on, couldn't stick around forever, couldn't it? And when it did, China splintered and much of the north fell under the control of non-Han, so-called barbarian rulers. The 3rd through 6th century CE saw nearly constant warfare. It was a time known as the period of disunity, encompassing the 3 kingdoms and Qing dynasty and the northern and southern dynasties. During the early part of this era, China's Great Wall defenses suffered a lot of neglect, or were easily bypassed. In the 4th century, nomadic tribes such as the Xiongnu, Xianbei, and others actually established kingdoms inside what used to be Han borders. So clearly the old walls no longer marked a secure frontier when the enemies had effectively moved within them. It was not until the Northern Wei dynasty, 386 to 535 CE, a state founded by Xianbei, a nomadic people who had adopted many Chinese customs, the large-scale building was resumed. The Northern Wei unified northern China in the 5th century, and significantly, its rulers began to see value in Chinese-style defensive walls. As the Northern Wei became more Sinicized, i.e. they settled into the Chinese-style cities and relied on agriculture and taxation, they faced pressure from even fiercer nomads beyond the borders, notably the Zhouran, that is an Asian steppe nomad group, likely related to the later Mongolic groups. According to chronicles, in the year 423 CE, the Northern Wei Emperor ordered the construction of a defensive line over 2,000 li long, that is 1,100 kilometers, to repel the Zhouran. This wall roughly followed the old Zhao State Wall from Shanxi province, eastward through the mountains of Hebei, ending near what is today's Beijing vicinity. Then, in 446, Northern Wei mobilized 100,000 men to build an inner wall closer to the capital, then at Pingcheng near modern-day Datong. This inner wall stretched from the Yan Mountains, looped south of Pingcheng, and ended at the Yellow River's east bank. The combination of the two walls formed a double barrier protecting the Northern Wei heartland. Significantly, 1,000 years later, The Ming Dynasty would reuse the same corridor for its double-layered wall system around Beijing, but we'll get to them a bit later. Well, in addition to walls, the Northern Wei also established the famous 6 frontier towns, that is, heavily fortified military colonies on the edge of the steppe. They served as both defenses and launch points for campaigns. And this shows that by the 5th century, even a dynasty of nomadic origin recognized the strategic utility of walls to channel and deter the movements of other nomads. The Northern Wei eventually split and fell, succeeded by the Northern Qi, 550 to 577, and the Northern Zhou, 557 to 581. Now, these short-lived regimes took wall building to new heights, and perhaps new extremes. The Northern Qi, in particular, constructed an enormous length of new wall in a remarkably short time, facing the aggressive Gokturk Turks to the north. The Northern Qi, from 552 to 556, built up 3,000 li of walls, it's about 1,600 kilometers, from the Taihang Mountains in Shanxi, all the way to the eastern seaboard at the Shanhai Pass at the Bohai Gulf. Now, this undertaking was pretty colossal. In the year 555 AD alone, the state supposedly mobilized 1.8 million laborers to extend fortifications and build the Juyong Pass defenses north of modern Beijing. That number, even if exaggerated, indicates an extraordinary allocation of manpower. For comparison, 1.8 million might have been a significant portion of the able-bodied male population in northern Qi. In any case, the Qi wall was built in haste, largely with local earth, stones, and whatever natural barriers could be linked. One chronicle notes that in 557, northern Qi even constructed a secondary parallel wall inside the main wall, creating another layer of defense. Why not? 2 walls are better than 1, certainly. Fortunately for us, some remnants of the Qi wall survive today. Low stone and earth ridges, and a few meters high at that, and they're distinguishable by their reddish color due to the local soils, earning a later nickname, the Red Wall, in parts of Hebei. When the Northern Zhou conquered the Northern Qi in 577, they inherited the fortifications. The Northern Zhou rulers repaired and maintained the existing walls. Though they did not significantly expand them, their rule was short, ending just 4 years later in 581. But we find that by the end of the 6th century, a chain of walls and fortified passes stretched across northern China's frontier, much of it ancestor sections of wall that we know today. And interestingly, the route of the northern Qi and Zhou walls west of the Gubei Kou was later followed closely by the Ming Dynasty's wall in that region. However, wall building on such a scale, one can imagine, comes at quite a cost. The Northern Qi's frantic construction campaigns may have been blamed for burdening the populace and draining the treasury, and with that weakening the state. And indeed, Chinese historians through the ages frequently used the Northern Qi as a cautionary tale of a regime that toiled millions on walls only to fall swiftly to invaders. In their case, the Northern Zhou, who were rivals from the west, rather. Yet, the urge to secure the frontier with walls was irresistible whenever an immediate threat loomed. In any case, by 581, Yang Jian usurped the Northern Zhou throne and founded the Sui dynasty. And as we'll see, the Sui would continue wall building, perhaps to an even more ambitious extreme, one that nearly mirrored the first emperor of Qin's exploits, and with a similarly ruinous result. So let's talk about the Sui dynasty. They reunified China in 581 and lasted until 618 CE rather. The Sui emperors were determined to cement their control and protect their newly reconstituted empire, and they embarked on huge infrastructure projects. Grand canals, grander palaces, and even grander greater walls. The founding Sui emperor, Emperor Wen, that is also Yang Jian, and his son Yang Guang, devoted immense resources to frontier defenses against the Gokturk nomads, who at the time formed a vast Turkic empire to the north. The Sui thus represented another peak in Great Wall construction, but one tragically followed by the dynasty's collapse, due in part to the exhaustion of people under the heavy Corvée labor. Almost immediately after taking power, Emperor Wen began the wall construction. In 581, the very first year of Sui, he ordered walls to be built in Hebei and Shanxi provinces to guard against the Turks and their Kagan Ishbara. But the steppe threat was dynamic. In 582, the Gokturk forces simply just rode around the new walls to invade western China, raiding in Gansu and Shanxi. Realizing this was a gap in his defenses, Emperor Wen responded by extending the walls further west. Between 585 and 588, the Sui constructed walls through the Ordos region, the great northern bend of the Yellow River, into what is now Inner Mongolia. Even the official Sui histories note the scale of this effort. In 586, as many as 150,000 men were recorded working on these frontier walls, whether they liked it or not. Emperor Wen's successor, Emperor Yang of Sui, he was even more zealous. Around 607 to 608, he famously conscripted over 1 million laborers, a number repeated in multiple sources, but still might be a little blown out of proportion, to build a new Great Wall line in the northern wilderness. This wall ran roughly from Yulin in today's Shanxi, across the mountains and steppes towards what is near modern Hohhot in Inner Mongolia. This undertaking was immense. The Book of Sui claims that up to 500,000 people died on the work site. Whether or not that number is exaggerated, it still conveys the remembered toll. Entire peasant families were uprooted to toil on the frontier, and many of them never returned. The Sui walls themselves, hurriedly built of tampered earth and whatever materials at hand, stretched the empire's defenses to cover newly conquered territory in the north. Portions of Sui-era ramparts still survive in Inner Mongolia, by the way. They're typically low earthworks, about 2.5 meters tall, with watchtower fortifications rising a little bit higher. But it is worth noting that Emperor Yang's wall building was just one of his major projects. He also constructed the Grand Canal and launched massive military campaigns to invade Korea, at the time called Goguryeo. The simultaneous strain of these projects proved to be unbearable, and by the early 7th century the Sui populace was seething with discontent. Rebellions erupted across the land. The vast labor drafts for the Great Wall and other works had sapped the empire's strength and its loyalty, and in 618, Emperor Yang was assassinated, and the Sui dynasty imploded. 37 years in total. Well, as the Sui dynasty gave way, a new and more enduring dynasty took power, one that adopted a pretty different approach to frontier security. That was the Tang dynasty, and they would largely abandon the strategy of long wall building, favoring other methods to deal with the nomads. And here is a dramatic turning point in our story, the period where the Great Wall, for a time, lost its preeminence in the Chinese defense strategy. So, the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907, a true golden age. It's renowned for its cosmopolitan culture, military prowess, and, of course, expansive empire. Now, when the Tang founders, led by Emperor Gaozu and his son Emperor Taizong, established their rule, they inherited a China that was weary of Sui overexertion. The Tang emperors made a conscious choice to reverse the wall-building frenzy of their predecessors. Instead of pouring resources into repairing or extending the Great Wall, the Tang favored a combination of diplomacy, mobile cavalry armies, and forward offense to handle the northern threats. Early in his reign, Emperor Taizong, also known as Li Shimin, considered one of China's greatest rulers, by the way, was confronted with proposals to rebuild the aging walls as a defense against Turkic nomads who were still powerful in the steppe. And there's a famous anecdote from court records that illustrates the Taizong's view. When some officials urged restoring the Great Wall, Taizong scoffed at the idea, pointing out that the late Sui emperor had made the people toil to build great walls against the Turks, but in the end, this was of no use. Rather confidently, Taizong declared he needed only to station a capable general at the frontier to keep those nomads in check, implying that good leadership and offensive strategy would succeed where static walls might not. And, true to the philosophy, he appointed skilled generals like Li Shiji to lead swift cavalry strikes and preemptive campaigns into enemy territory, rather than hunkering down behind the defensive walls. Thus, during the Tang, we see minimal new wall construction. The regime did maintain fortified outposts and garrisons along key routes, but these were essentially walled cities or forts rather than continuous walls. For example, the Tang built a chain of garrison towns in the steppe, with grandiose names like cities of submission, though they were actually military bases to overawe the tribes. The idea of all this was to project power beyond China's immediate border. At its height, the Tang Empire expanded into parts of Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Central Asia, often negating the need for a defensive wall on those frontiers because Tang armies patrolled far afield. But it's not that the Tang empires naively ignored defense. Rather, they believed a strong cavalry and diplomatic management of nomadic tribes through titles, marriage alliances, and trade would be far more effective, and not to mention less costly, than wall building. And for a time, this proved to be quite true. In 630, Emperor Taizong's forces defeated the Eastern Turk Khaganate, and the Tang established suzerainty over much of the steppe, even taking the title Heavenly Khagan. With the major nomadic threats subdued, no extensive wall building took place for the next 2 centuries. The Great Wall from previous eras gradually deteriorated in many places, unused and unmaintained, though sections near strategic passes were likely still garrisoned to guard entry points. Another factor of this was that the Tang, unlike most earlier dynasties, had extended well north of the old Qin-Han border. For instance, Tang controlled the Ordos Loop and beyond, that is the region inside the big northern bend of the Yellow River. A territory, of course, that earlier had walls that marked its edge. Now it was just not necessary, it was actually the interior. Tang China's frontiers were delineated more by natural barriers and distance. The deserts and the mountains of Inner Asia, things like this. The concept of a linear barrier was less relevant when the empire's influence stretched deep into the steppe. So instead, the Tang set up the protectorate of the western regions and other frontier jurisdictions to manage far-flung areas without physically walling them off. And ironically, the absence of wall building in Tang times is recorded in later histories as a sign of confidence and strength. A Tang poet might boast that China was so powerful that our virtue is enough of a wall, a line reflecting the ideal that a truly great dynasty doesn't need to hide behind fortifications. However, later on in Tang rule, especially by the 9th century, the empire weakened, and nomadic pressures, like those from the Tibetan Empire and the Uyghurs, increased. Even then, though, we do not read of any significant great new wall campaigns. The Tang's decline was due more to internal rebellions, like the An Lushan Rebellion of 755, than foreign invasion, and their frontier defenses remained the network of military colonies and alliances, rather than defensive new walls. Now, we could talk about the Tang Dynasty all day. Really, we could. But this is about the Great Wall, not the Tang Dynasty, so let's move on from them. And following the Tang, China enters another period of division. That was the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1269. They eventually unified the south and central parts of China, but notably did not control the traditional northern frontier regions that earlier walls had spanned. Instead, powerful barbarian empires ruled the north. First, the Khitan Liao dynasty, 907 to 1125 in the northeast, and then the Jurchen Jin dynasty, 1115 to 1234, which conquered the Liao and also overrun North China, carving the Song Empire in half, basically. And in the northwest, the Tangut Western Xia dynasty, 1038 to 1227. Now, interestingly, each of these non-Han dynasties engaged in some wall building of their own, illustrating that the concept of frontier walls was not unique to the Han Chinese, but could be adopted by others when useful. The Khitan Liao, who were semi-nomadic peoples from Manchuria, or Dongbei, as we call it today, established control over a huge swath of territory, including modern Mongolia and northeast China. The Liao had a hybrid, nomadic-style kind of rule. They generally relied on cavalry mobility and tribute relations rather than walls for defense, and there's not much evidence that the Liao built long walls on the scale of a great wall. However, they did fortify certain border areas. Notably, the Liao and their southern neighbor, the northern Song Chinese state, fixed their boundary by treaty, which ran through what is now Hebei and Shanxi provinces. The Song, lacking control of the steppe, sometimes made use of pre-existing walls as part of this boundary. For instance, one historical note says that the Song-Liao border in places followed an old northern Qi wall that still stood, showing how these fortifications could outlast the states that built them. Now let's talk about the Western Xia, that is the Tangut Kingdom. They were located in what is now northwestern China, Ningxia and parts of Gansu and Inner Mongolia. They're a bit of an intriguing case. The Tanguts were a Tibeto-Burman people who traditionally were not known for building long walls. They were more famed as horsemen and castle builders. Yet archaeological discoveries in recent years have revealed that the Western Xia did construct substantial walls on the northern frontier. In 2011, archaeologists in the desert of Omnagovi province of Mongolia, just beyond today's northern Chinese border, uncovered about 100 kilometers of long walls that lay within what was Western Xia territory. Radiocarbon dating placed the construction between 1040 and 1160, and that's squarely within the Western Xia period. These walls, built of mud and local shrubs in some sections and black volcanic basalt rocks in others, show a fairly sophisticated method, suggesting transport of materials and organized labor even in harsh terrain. And believe me, up there the terrain is very harsh, not to mention the sun in the summer. Oof. Or the winter's worse, actually. Not for the sun, but for the cold. In any case, they reached about 2.7 meters high, and were likely a couple of meters taller originally. The Western Xia likely built them to defend against Mongolic or Turkic nomads to their north, perhaps the rising power of Genghis Khan's Mongols in the early 13th century. However, it appears these walls were incomplete or quickly overrun. The fact that archaeologists found little traces of human activity like garrison posts along one stretch suggests it may have never been fully manned. But nevertheless, it's quite remarkable to think of a smaller kingdom like the Western Xia investing in walls in the Gobi Desert. One more testament how dire the nomadic threat was becoming. And speaking of threats, in the early 13th century, the Jin Empire came under assault by the formidable forces of Genghis Khan and his Mongol hordes. Historical records show that the Mongols generally did not attempt to storm the Jin Great Wall head-on. Instead, they brilliantly outmaneuvered it. In 1211, for example, Genghis Khan's armies found a gap at an underdefended section in the modern Zhangjiakou. Rather than attacking the fortified Juyong Pass directly, the Mongol cavalry just rode around the end of the wall, through an open corridor, and then turned on the opposing forces from behind, winning a devastating victory at the Battle of Yehuling. Elsewhere, the Mongols exploited treachery and resentment. Many frontier garrisons were staffed by Khitan and other non-Jurchen troops. When the Mongols invaded, some of those Khitan defenders saw the Mongols as liberators, of a sort at least, and they surrendered without a fight, opening gates that rendered the walls useless. One by one, the Mongols penetrated the defenses. Only at Juyong Pass, a crucial fortified gate in the Great Wall northwest of Beijing, did a serious engagement occur. The Mongol general, Jebei, avoided a protracted siege by luring the Jin defenders out of the pass and ambushing them, then charging through the open gates. By 1215, Genghis had captured the Jin capital, Yanjing, modern-day Beijing, of course. The Jin court retreated south, but the dynasty eventually fell in 1234, under the onslaught of Genghis's successors. The Western Xia, too, fell to Genghis Khan in 1227, famously after the dying Genghis ordered the annihilation of that great kingdom. Any incomplete walls they had were no salvation, and the Song Chinese in the south, though they had fewer walls on the open plains, held out behind their formidable city walls until 1279, when the Mongols finally extinguished the last Song stronghold. And so by the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire, that becoming the Yuan dynasty in China, reigned supreme. And for the first time in history, all of China and the vast steppe beyond the west were under one rule. In such a context, the Great Wall paused. There was simply no need for a barrier within an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary under Mongol rule. And philosophically, the Mongols were a mobile, expansive power that saw fortifications as obstacles to be circumvented or absorbed, not lines to establish themselves. Well, as a telling anecdote, when Marco Polo traveled through Yuan China in the late 13th century, he made no mention of the Great Wall in his account. This has often been cited to suggest that the Great Wall was not a prominent feature in the consciousness of people at the time, or that it was in such disrepair that it did not merit any note. In any case, the Yuan fell in 1368 rather, and with that there was the rise of a native Chinese dynasty, the Ming. That was from 1368 to 1644, and they came to power and kicked the Mongols out. Early Ming emperors, particularly the founding Hongwu emperor, known by his actual name, Zhu Yuanzhang, believed in maintaining a strong military presence in the steppe and using a forward defense to prevent the Mongols from regrouping. In his first few decades after 1368, the Ming armies even pursued the retreating Mongols deep into Mongolia, and the court established a series of outer garrisons beyond the Great Wall's latter line. The whole idea of this was to keep the former Mongol Yuan rulers on the run and not allow a stable power to form just outside the borders. However, as decades passed, the realities of sustaining long-term campaigns on the steppe were setting in. Logistics were difficult. Mongol cavalry could strike and vanish, and Ming resources, though vast, were certainly not infinite. By the 1440s, the Ming stance shifted from offense to defense. A watershed moment was the Tumu crisis of 1449, in which a Ming emperor, Zhengtong, personally led a campaign against the Oirat Mongols, and it was a disastrous failure. The Ming army was annihilated, and the emperor himself was captured by the Oirat leader S.N. Khan. This humiliation shook the Ming leadership to the core. It made clear that aggressive expeditions could be high risk. After the Tumu debacle, Ming strategy increasingly emphasized protecting the core Chinese territories, especially the capital region around Beijing, rather than trying to hold remote steppe ground. And this crisis, the Tumu crisis that is often cited as the turning point, after which the Ming largely became defensively minded on the northern front. Already before Tumu, some defensive measures were in place. Emperor Yongle had moved the Ming capital from Nanjing in the south up to Beijing in 1421, precisely to better manage the Mongol threat from the north. And just quickly, Nanjing literally means southern capital. Beijing literally means northern capital. So there's that for you. In any case, around Beijing, the Ming fortified key passes in the mountains, often building on earlier walls in those areas. For instance, in the late 14th century and early 15th, the Ming erected or reinforced walls in the Liaodong region, which is today's Liaoning province, to guard against the remnants of Mongols and Jurchens in Manchuria. They also set up 130 military outposts at strategic points north of the capital, on the advice of frontier experts. These outposts, some connected by short walls, formed a kind of cordon in the Beijing-Hebei area. But initially these were meant for regional defense, not a continuous Great Wall. After 1449, the Ming doubled down on their wall construction. The late 15th century saw successive Ming rulers and generals fortifying what are called the 9 frontier defense commands, which covered different stretches from the Bohai Sea in the east to Gansu in the west. The most famous wall segments near Beijing, like those at Juyong Pass, Gubeikou, and Moutianyu, etc., were built or greatly strengthened during this time, that is the 1480s to 1500s. The early Ming walls were often still rammed earth and tamped rubble, but as Mongol raids kept going, the Ming began upgrading critical portions of the wall to stone and brick. A pivotal series of events occurred in the 16th century. In 1550, the Mongol leader Altan Khan, frustrated by Ming trade restrictions, led a large cavalry force right up to the gates of Beijing in an audacious raid. Altan cleverly bypassed the heavy defenses of the main Ming frontier, the Xuanfu-Datong line, by detouring to an inadequately defended sector at Gubeikou, sneaking through a pass and wreaking havoc on the outskirts of the capital. The raid of 1550 was quite a shock. According to one source, over 60,000 people were killed, and another 40,000 were captured around Beijing during that incursion. The Ming court realized that the existing walls in that area were too low and sparse to stop determined horsemen. In reaction, the Ming moved the focus of defense precisely where Altan had broken through, the Jizhou and Changping commands, northeast of Beijing. In the aftermath of 1550, they embarked on rapidly upgrading the wall there to stone and mortar. The new walls were built atop steep ridges wherever possible, with higher ramparts, proper battlements, also known as crenellations, and integrated guard towers. When Mongol raiders tried a similar attack just a few years later in 1554, they were reportedly shocked to encounter a much taller stone wall and fierce resistance, resulting in their defeat. This success greatly encouraged the pro-wall faction at the Ming court. Shortly after, in 1567, the Ming appointed 2 experienced generals, Qi Jiguang and Tan Lun to take charge of the frontier defenses in crucial Beijing sectors. Qi Jiguang had earlier won fame fighting pirates along the southeast coast, and now he turned his considerable energy to the northern walls. Between 1568 and 1572, Qi Jiguang oversaw one of the most intensive phases of wall construction in Chinese history. It's recorded that under Qi's direction, the Ming built 1,200 new watchtowers. Critically, Qi Jiguang introduced the innovation of hollow brick towers. Until then, many wall towers had just been solid mounds with a hut or platform on top for a few guards. But Qi's towers were multi-story brick fortifications with interior rooms, allowing soldiers to live inside, store ample weapons and grain, and shelter from weather and arrows. These robust towers, many of which still stand today, give the Ming Wall a tremendous defensive depth. Archers and later musketeers could fire from embrasures on multiple levels, and troops could rapidly respond along the wall walk between towers. So now the wall was a bit more recognizable to our modern Great Wall, but it is important to note that the Ming did not view it as a standalone solution. They continued to use diplomacy on occasional offensives too. For example, after Aldan Khan's raids were thwarted, they chose to negotiate. In 1571, they granted the Mongols lucrative trade terms, essentially opening border markets, and that peace stopped large Mongol incursions for a couple of decades. During this relative calm, Qi Jiguang and colleagues hastened to close all the gaps in the frontier defenses. They walled off even rugged terrain that earlier had been left open. The reasoning for that: well, what is impossible to an army one year might be possible in a drought, or if an enemy finds a new path. This is why today you can see the Great Wall trail across incredibly steep ridges. The Ming decided to seal the border completely, creating the spectacular stone dragon that winds unbroken over the mountains. It's really quite a sight to see. You must see it. While the Ming Great Wall achieved its immediate aim, it significantly impeded Mongol raids. Job done. While minor raids continued and some traders still smuggled goods across, the Mongols could no longer penetrate in large numbers easily. But for nearly a century, the Ming Wall stood as the empire's shield. However, it was not a complete safeguard. In the early 17th century, the Ming began to face new problems: internal rebellions and a new external enemy, the rising Manchus, descendants of the Jurchens, led by Nurhaci and his heirs. The Manchus were uniting up in Dongbei and would soon challenge the Ming. Meanwhile, prolonged fiscal strain and climate-induced famines led to peasant uprisings within Ming China. The Great Wall, despite being maintained to the end, couldn't do a thing about turmoil from within. The end of the Ming and the role of the Great Wall was quite a drama. In 1644, a rebel army led by Li Zicheng captured the Ming capital, Beijing, after the desperate Ming defenders surrendered several key passes without a fight. They were starved, and not to mention mutinous. The last Ming emperor hanged himself in the palace gardens as rebels swarmed the city. At the same time, on the far northeastern frontier, the Manchu leader Prince Dorgon saw an opportunity. A Ming general, Wu Sangui, was in charge of Shanhai Pass, the eastern terminus of the Great Wall at the sea. Caught between Li Zicheng's rebels now controlling Beijing and the approaching Manchu army, Wu Sangui made a fateful decision. He opened the gates of Shanhai Pass and invited the Manchus in. The Manchu banner armies marched through the Great Wall, not by breaching it, but by just going through the door, let in by a Chinese general switching sides. Well, in May of 1644, the Battle of the Shanghai Pass, the Manchu forces joined Wu's remaining troops and defeated Li Zicheng's rebels. By June 1644, the Manchus occupied Beijing and soon proclaimed the Qing Dynasty. Thus, the Ming, the greatest wall-building dynasty in Chinese history, fell in part because of the Great Wall's strongest gate being opened from within. The Mongols, whom the wall had largely held at bay, were not the ones to topple the Ming, but it was a combination of internal collapse and the ascent of a new foe who gained entry through guile and betrayal. Well, yet the Ming Wall itself, the physical edifice, remained. Its impressive ramparts would stand for centuries to come and endure through a new foreign dynasty and into the modern era. And here let's talk about the Great Wall under the Qing. The Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1912, was established by the Manchus, a people from beyond the Great Wall. And understandably, the Qing had a different attitude towards the wall itself. They did not need it to protect against themselves, of course. And once in power, they also expanded the empire far to the north and the west, in effect rendering the wall obsolete as a defensive boundary. The Qing controlled Manchuria, the Manchu homeland, Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet, areas well outside or beyond the old Ming frontiers. Since the empire now encompassed the homelands of the very nomads the walls had been trying to repel, maintaining a large wall along the former border was no longer a strategic necessity. In fact, the Qing were somewhat weary of the symbolism of the Great Wall, as conquerors who wanted to legitimize their rule over the Han Chinese, and also integrate Mongols and others. The Qing rulers downplayed any notion of a strict divide between Chinese civilization and barbarians marked by a wall. The Great Wall represented, in cultural terms, the old Ming ideology of Han-centered defense separation. The Qing preferred to promote an image of unified and multi-ethnic empire under heaven's banner, not a China closed off by barriers. And consequently, they did very little to repair or rebuild the wall, beyond basic upkeep in a few sections, and in some cases they even repurposed parts of it. But one interesting use of wall-like structures by the Qing was the willow palisade that is up in Manchuria. This was not a stone wall, but an extensive fence of packed earth and willow trees planted across southern parts of southern Manchuria, and its purpose was not to keep enemies out, but rather to restrict Han Chinese migration into those northeastern regions, which the Qing considered the sacred homeland of their people. The Qing, having conquered China, wanted to preserve Manchuria as a Manchu preserve, at least until the late dynasty when pressures changed. So the Willow Palisade and existing Ming Liaodong Wall were used somewhat like administrative borders, controlling movement of Chinese farmers rather than defensive lines. That's a bit of an ironic twist. The Great Wall under the Qing served as an inward control rather than an outward defense in some locales. Well, culturally, the Qing elite didn't celebrate the Great Wall much. In fact, they suppressed, to an extent, its mythos. Traditional Chinese literati had sometimes referred to the Great Wall as a symbol separating the Chinese and the barbarians. The Qing, being of the outer origins themselves, generally discouraged any ideology painting them beyond the pale. Thus we don't see Qing emperors writing poems praising the wall. Instead, they emphasized the inclusivity of the empire. One Qing emperor, Qianlong, even wrote poems in Chinese and Manchu language, extolling the united realms of the dynasty with no mention of needing walls to do so. Meanwhile, outside eyes began to take notice. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European traders, missionaries, and diplomats reaching China had heard rumors of an awe-inspiring wall. Jesuit missionaries in the Qing court, such as Father Jean-Baptiste Regis, mapped China, and in doing so, traced the line of the wall on Western maps for the first time. In 1667, the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher included an illustration of the Great Wall in his book, China Illustrated, labeling it a Gate of the Wall of China, and explaining its structure. This early depiction, based on reports from Jesuits in Beijing, fired the imagination of Europeans, and by the 18th century, the Great Wall was becoming known in Europe as one of the wonders of the East, though often with a great deal of fanciful exaggeration. For example, when Lord Macartney led the first British embassy to China in 1793, his delegation passed through a section of the wall north of Beijing. One of his companions, a diplomat named John Barrow, later wrote about the wall with a mix of admiration and disappointment, noting its grand extent, but also its disrepair, and that it wasn't as colossal as imagination had suggested. Nevertheless, the mystique grew. Western accounts often emphasized it as a singular monument of antiquity. The idea that the Great Wall was the only man-made structure visible from the moon emerged in the 19th century, but like we said in the introduction, it's quite a myth, popularized by various travel writers long before anybody could even verify that authenticity. In reality, while the wall is very long, it is very narrow, so it generally blends in with the environment. Even from low Earth orbit, it's not easily discernible to the naked eye, certainly not from the moon. Now, after the Qing fell in 1912, and the Chinese Republic, later the People's Republic, emerged, the Great Wall underwent a transformation in meaning. What had been a Qing ignored relic became a potent symbol of national pride and continuity. Chinese revolutionaries and reformers, seeking to build a new national identity, latched onto the Great Wall as a token of the nation's longevity and ability to withstand hardship. And there was plenty of hardship, don't worry about that. The very term Great Wall, Changcheng in Chinese, started appearing in political rhetoric, poems, and popular culture as something that united the people. There is a famous slogan by Sun Yat-sen, that is Sun Zhongshan in the other rendering, founder of the Republic of China, that urged the Chinese to, quote, become as strong as the Great Wall. And later, Mao Zedong, in a 1935 poem, wrote the line, 不到长城非好汉, which means, well, pretty much if you haven't gone to the Great Wall, you're not a true hero. Well, that links the idea of achieving greatness with climbing the wall, a line still often quoted by tourists who clamber up to the site at Bada Ling. And then, through the 20th century, portions of the wall suffered from both neglect and intentional damage. During China's warlord era and the Second Sino-Japanese War, some sections saw fighting. In the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 76, some bricks were taken by villagers or Red Guards for use in local construction, since old monuments were not a priority to protect. But as China began to open up and appreciate its heritage again, efforts shifted to preservation, and in 1987, the Great Wall was designated a UNESCO Heritage Site, cementing its status as a treasure for all humanity, and one that we can very luckily enjoy today. And that's where it comes to an end. I hope you've enjoyed the full history of the Great Wall. I enjoyed doing it. I visited the wall first, I think it was in 2018, and I was up in Beijing a few months ago when saw Imperial Triumphant play there too. That was interesting. Anyway, you don't want to hear about that. I'm going to thank all of my top-tier patrons and supporters, both on YouTube and Patreon. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carey, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfanir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftus, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, and Are You My Mom? Okay then. Alright everyone, well that's it from me. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video, whether you're sleeping or whether you're just learning something. Who knows? Maybe you're doing the gardening or cleaning the home. You know where I'll be. Right here on YouTube, waiting for the next time you feel inclined to return, when another topic catches your attention. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.